This is Section 2, the changing balance of American federalism over time. Once again, we discussed the original goals of federalism: to enable the government to take effective action, to help maintain economic stability, to regulate disputes among the states, and to preserve state independence. It's important that you remember the original goals of federalism, okay? Because you need to remember that one side wanted complete national supremacy, the other side wanted states' rights, right? And so the single most persistent source of political conflict has been the relations between the national and state governments, and we'll come back to that. The effects on state politics. States really benefit from the national government. The federal relationship puts the states in competition with each other, and in that competition, they can outbid other states for businesses, corporations, etc. For instance, in the early 1980s, Tennessee outbid other states for a Nissan automobile plant by paying roughly $11,000 per job. In 1993, Alabama won a 35-state race to grab the Mercedes-Benz plant with an incentive plan that cost the state around $200,000 for each expected job. The legislatures in the state consider the deals, and they debate the pros and cons, and whichever state comes out on top is the one that has outbid. So keep that in mind, okay? Because of this competition, it has become known as smokestack chasing, all right? The bidding also occurs with professional sports teams, etc. States assume costs of roads, sewers, other infrastructure when new corporations are coming in, and that helps the states continue to thrive and offer jobs and boost their economic stability. On the citizens, we do have an effect. Citizens have access to officials and the processes of government, and they try and influence public policy, by using interest groups of people who have the same, they're organized groups of citizens. They share the same social, political, or other goals, and they want something changed for their betterment, and they believe it's the betterment of the state. If a group isn't successful at the state level, they can try the local level, and that's exactly what they will do. Interest groups have an easier time gaining influence in a state rather than in Washington, mainly because you're dealing with a smaller venue. Results of the increased flexibility under federalism. Federalism does give that flexibility. It helps you preserve your local standards and values and respond to local needs, and you're solving problems at the local level. At the same time, you want to keep in mind that at the state level, you may have the option of passing stricter anti-pollution laws, for instance, than the federal government. But it does give you flexibility. That would be something that would be a state issue, not a local issue. Some local issues are things like school policies, building codes, housing codes, etc. All right. Here its advantages. State experiments, one of which is the Welfare Reform Act. Okay, that's definitely been an advantage to some states like Michigan, but not to all states. Okay, go back and look at the third clip from the federalism video about Mississippi. All right. Another example, all right, of an experiment would be in 1993, Georgia policymakers developed a way to fund higher education that would make going to school in Georgia more attractive. They wanted to keep their brightest young people from studying in other states. Georgia pays tuition, fees, and a book allowance for any Georgia resident who completes high school with a B average. Okay? The long-term benefit, students who graduated from Georgia schools might be more likely to get jobs there and pay taxes to the state. Also, these students would increase the overall education level of the state's workforce. Okay, so keep that in mind. Disadvantages. Well, one of the biggest disadvantages, all right, is you have what they call an absorption of great expenses that can occur. For instance, all right, obviously then that's cost we're talking about. More agencies that participate in a particular program, the less it will cost individual agencies to operate. And these savings are referred to as economies of scale. When policies, as your book says, are made and enforced locally, all economies of scale are lost. So what you have is you have repeated functions across the country as states administer national programs. All right, so it leads to the cutting of programs specifically for those that live below the poverty level. States do not want to have more generous benefits than nearby states because it would attract poor people to them. So then it ends up getting cut. Okay, it also causes inconsistencies, just like I said, from state to state. Now you have the balance between the national government and the states. All right. Think in terms of the fact that you are a member of a new constitutional convention, charged with making the balance between state and national power more explicit and less vague. Okay? How difficult would it be to propose, debate, and vote on various proposals? Well, the balance of power between the national government and the state has changed over time. It's happened for several reasons. Okay? One, the founders certainly disagreed how power should be distributed, and so the wording in the Constitution is very vague. The Constitution was able to get ratified because of that, so keep that in mind. Number two, the Supreme Court has affected the balance of national and state power because its interpretation of the Constitution has changed over time and as it relates to certain events and merits of the case. Historical circumstances have affected the way the court rules. And third, certain circumstances or major events have altered the balance of state and national power. The Civil War, for instance, transformed state and national power. Okay, the end of slavery, the growth of industrialization and big business, the Great Depression, the terrorist attacks of September 11th, world wars, all of these events helped shift the demands of the different levels of government, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, etc. American government has grown. It has grown at the national level. It has grown at the state level, and it has grown at the local level. The Civil War, as you know, was fought in part over the issue of national supremacy versus states' rights. The Civil War settled one matter: the national government was supreme, its sovereignty derived directly from the people, and thus the states could not lawfully secede from the Union. During the formative years of the new republic, the Supreme Court was led by a staunch and brilliant advocate of Hamilton's position, which was national supremacy, known as Chief Justice John Marshall. The court defended the national supremacy view of the newly formed federal government, specifically in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. Now, you have discussed the case of McCulloch versus Maryland already, and the issues were, first issue, did Congress have the right to set up the bank? And the answer to that is yes, by virtue of the Necessary and Proper Clause. And the second question is, can a state tax a federal bank? And the answer to that is no. The power to tax involves the power to destroy. No state can tax a function of the federal government. The other issue then was nullification. Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. States had the right to nullify or declare null and void, that was written in the resolutions, a federal law that, in the state's opinion, violated the Constitution. Opposition to a tariff, opposition to the restriction of slavery, all of these things led to the issue, of states' rights versus federal rights. Okay? The conclusion, states cannot declare acts of Congress unconstitutional and therefore nullify them and not have them apply to the states. Okay? So the whole idea of nullification, which is the idea that states could nullify or reject national laws with which they disagreed, does not exist. Okay? I can give you an example. Suppose Congress passed a law that placed a federal tax on all purchases made over the internet. If a state passed a law saying the tax would not be enforced in its territory, that would constitute nullification. That's a perfect example. So why has government really grown? Okay, effectively. All right. Well, before we come to that, and I think that we need to mention a couple of other things. All right. We need to mention about, okay, the New Deal. All right, and national power over business. The one thing that the Civil War doesn't settle is the question of the proper balance of power between national government and business interests. So in the time period that comes after the war, the courts end up striking down both state and national laws regulating business. Things change significantly once FDR becomes president after the crash of 29, and FDR's presidency begins in 1932. But to give you an example of the court striking down both state and national laws, I give you Lochner versus New York, which is a 1905 decision. Lochner said that states could not regulate bakers' working hours, a ruling that was used as an anti-regulation precedent until the New Deal in the 1930s. Okay, and keep in mind, all right, once you hit the 1930s, you hit the New Deal time period. Okay. So during the New Deal, the 1930s, the Supreme Court continued to stand against regulation, and Roosevelt criticized the court for that, all right, for striking down his programs. But many programs continued during the time of FDR's presidency, and some, all right, programs that we still have today, all right, continued. Old age, Social Security, disability insurance, unemployment compensation, food stamps. Many of those items were started during the Great Depression and still continue today, even though they have been revised. Okay. Civil rights, all right, the time period of the civil rights and the 14th Amendment, which was passed after the Civil War. to hopefully make sure southern states extended the protections of the Constitution to the newly freed slaves. Now, you and I both know that it took the 1960s, all right, and the Supreme Court striking down state laws that continued segregation for the 14th Amendment to be enforced, okay? And that takes us to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. By the time you hit the 70s, the expansion of the court's interpretation of the 14th Amendment is huge, okay? Many state laws had been declared unconstitutional because they were depriving state citizens of the rights as U.S. citizens. The example in your book is, courts ruled that states must guarantee people accused of state crimes the same protections that Bill of Rights guarantees to those accused of federal crimes. That whole process continued the increase of national power through the 70s, all right, until we hit the later 70s and the 80s. Once we have President Nixon and well, he left under Watergate, but once President Reagan comes in, some of the responsibilities, he tries to return some responsibilities to the states, all right, and in that's in how the states spend federal grant money that they receive, and that's in the next section, okay, and that'll talk about the altering of the balance of federal power in favor of the states. The problem is that in order to do that, that means the federal government has to give the states more federal grant money, and President Reagan raised the debt ceiling he didn't, but got Congress to raise the debt ceiling numerous times so that he could expand federal grant money to the states and let them have a little more control. Okay, events, once again, that change government power. All right, and that's the end of section 2. This is section 3. The politics of contemporary federalism. And in this section, you're going to discuss, all right, really the relationship between the national government and the states, okay? And they're going to give you a little test case on that, all right, which it deals with Congress and education, and we can understand that one, all right, based on the No Child Left Behind Act, okay? So in this one, imagine that a new bridge is being opened that was built with federal and state money, okay? So therefore, right, who decides how the bridge is going to be built? Well, you have cooperation between these two states, all right? What happens is the national government influences the way that states and localities provide the goods and services, all right? The states and local governments don't like to let the federal government in regulating their activities, all right, that have been part of state and local government jurisdiction, but you'll find that if they're going to take federal money, all right, they're going to have to bring the federal government in to help regulate. I'll give you an example, okay? Social and economic problems, such as pollution and discrimination, are much easier to solve at the national level, but they have to be enforced sometimes at the local level. So if Procter & Gamble decides to emit toxic fumes on Saturdays when the EPA may not catch them as easily, all right, is it the responsibility, okay, of the state government to also help monitor the federal government, the EPA? I don't have an answer to that, but the federal government can't constantly be monitoring, so it is the responsibility of the state government and local government and of the citizens to complain if they smell something that they think may be toxic. Generally, members of Congress, the representatives, and the senators want to control policies that will affect their states, okay? their constituents then see them as really good individuals that are answering and responding to the voters, all right, and they're seen as delivering positive social and economic benefits to their states. Congress also has the ability to block states from doing certain things, for instance, such as practicing segregation, because that's a violation, all right, of the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay. For example, let's use a different kind of example. All right. Corporations prefer to have a single set of laws governing their activities coming from the national government. If Congress makes a set of nationally binding regulations, a business does not have to incur the expense of changing its product or service to meet different state standards as it opens manufacturing places from one state to the other. All right. Why would members of Congress be willing to grant the desires of corporate leaders in this matter? So they can control the way the rules are written, which would not be the case with state regulations, all right? And because corporations can contribute to their re-election campaigns. So keep that in mind. Okay. There is a handout that is at school that I would like to give you on dual federalism, and I'll talk about that, all right, at this point. Okay. It's called, typically it's called layer cake federalism, all right, and marble cake federalism. And I will, though the national government is supreme in its sphere, the states were equally supreme in theirs. And these two spheres of action should and could be kept separate. For example, Congress regulates interstate commerce, states regulate intrastate commerce. Commerce, however, is like a stream flowing through the country, drawing to itself contributions from thousands of scattered enterprises and depositing its products in millions of individual homes. All right. The Supreme Court has permitted the federal government in numerous cases to regulate almost anything that affects that stream of commerce from one state to the other. Okay, there's a couple of cases I can give you for that. All right. Okay, if something affects interstate commerce, anything that affects interstate commerce, the national government, all right, is going to be involved in the regulation of it. All right. Now I'll give you a case, and this is in your book, I believe, all right, where the Supreme Court believed that this particular state law, all right, this particular federal law, all right, does not involve interstate commerce, and it's the Prince versus the U.S. case, PRINTZ. The court invalidated a law that required local police to conduct background checks on all gun purchases. The U.S. Congress said that was necessary because the sale of guns is always part of interstate commerce. Well, that doesn't apply to the background checks. All right, so we want to keep that in mind. I'll attach the photo, or I will try and attach the photo of dual and the information on dual federalism at the end of this discussion. Sometimes it's really difficult to get states to agree on what needs to be done. And I think that the test case in your book, all right, beginning on page 121 is perfect, all right, okay, all right, and we'll get to that. Let's see, all right, let's go back, all right, to getting states to cooperate. Your textbook gives this example. Assume that members of Congress believe that more math training needs to take place in U.S. high schools for the nation to remain competitive in the world economy. How will Congress get the education policymakers to go along with it? All right. Well, they have two resources for influencing the states. One is authority and the other one is money. Okay, so keep in mind that Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 says, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. To which branch of the federal government does this article give power to give money to the states? The legislative branch. Why? Because it makes the laws. All right. The winners and the losers in the political process are going to change depending upon what option Congress chooses. Okay. So there are three options that are mentioned in your book. All right. One is no national government influence. All right. And that is where most domestic policy decisions are left to the states. The second one is by categorical grants, and we'll talk about these. All right. A categorical grant, okay, is a categorical grant is a grant that has a specific purpose defined by federal law. Usually the state or local government is required to match part of the federal grant. One response is to consolidate the categorical and project grants into a single grant devoted to some general purpose and with fewer restrictions on its use. Okay? So keep that in mind. All right. Categorical grants are a matter of life and death to some agencies. They are supervised by special congressional committees, and they are used for expansion, all right, on certain projects or things that the state is involved with. A block grant is next. Okay. The block grant is a grant, as you see here. It has broad grants of power within program areas. Most states prefer block grants, all right, because it takes funds from the federal treasury. It does have program requirements, but they're not as strict as categorical grants. For example, block grants were pushed by Republican presidents Nixon, Ford, and Reagan. The largest block grant, however, was instituted under Democratic President Bill Clinton with the passage of the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. This reform changed a categorical program called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC, to a block grant program called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TANF. Under AFDC, Washington had set the terms for cash aid to poor families with children, funded the program, and required the states to meet federal specifications. Under TANF, the states have greater leeway in defining many rules of their welfare programs, although they have to spend at certain levels and must meet some standards. If you watch the third clip of the federalism film from Democracy in America on Learner.org, you will see where that worked in some states. It'll show you Michigan, and then it's going to show you Mississippi where it didn't work. And it's the state's problem that it didn't work. It's their fault, all right, because of the way they distribute the money and the way they have the programs set up, all right. Okay. The next one is unfunded mandates, and you should be very familiar with unfunded mandates. I'll give you an example that you may not be aware of. An unfunded mandate, all right, is, hold on, all right, is not always tied to grant money. There are federal controls on the states, but generally there's no money, all right? Most mandates concern civil rights and environmental protection. Mandates are not all created equal. They're regulatory statutes. They're written in vague language. Sometimes they have new areas of federal involvement. Many mandates are hard to interpret. They're difficult to administer. They have high or uncertain costs. The federal government can also impose costs on states and local governments through tax and regulatory policy, federal court decisions, administrative regulations. There's no constitutional protection against a mandate. All right, perfect example was busing. All right, in the 60s, one of the best known unpopular examples of a mandate in order to desegregate schools. Okay. Another example is one unfunded mandate is the Americans with Disability Act of 1990, which requires states to guarantee access for the physically disabled to all public buildings and programs. Although the goals of the act are popular, the provision of federal requirements without federal funding remains controversial. Okay, so keep that, and you're very familiar with one, which is an unfunded mandate, which is the No Child Left Behind Act, which sets up the testing, proficiency testing, all right, or graduation testing for students in states. I do want to mention a couple of other things about grants and aid, block grants, categorical grants, etc. In theory, accepting aid from the national government is accepting conditions, and so it's voluntary. In reality, about 25% of state budgets depend on federal aid. Passing laws to meet the concerns of natural constituencies, such as leaving the cities and states to pay the bills and manage the problems, began to seem attractive to Congress during the Reagan administration. 1981 budget cuts, state and local governments found new ways of delivering services. But what happens is, all right, what has happened is a real devolution revolution of an attempt to try and shift important functions back to the states. And that's what we see with the Welfare Reform Act during the Clinton administration in 1996, all right, and to scale back the size and activities of the federal government. Okay, there are certain block grants to entitlements at the state level. One is an operational grant. Okay, there are certain operational grants for the purpose of running state programs such as child care. There are capital grants for projects such as building an Interstate 75 bridge, but really it's only matching funds and building a water waste plant. There are entitlement grants for to give children whose parents are living below the poverty line health care under Medicaid. But this whole idea of moving power and responsibility from the federal government to the states has now become a second order devolution, where we're trying to move power and responsibility from the states to the local government. And we're also seeing a third order devolution, which is an increased role of nonprofit organizations and private groups in policy implementation. Okay, so what's driving the devolution? What's driving devolution? One, deep-seated ideological mistrust of the federal government, plus the belief that governments closer to the people, local and state, are more responsive to popular sentiment and not as wasteful. 2. Deficit politics, cuts in entitlement spending, such as in Medicaid, SNAP, which is food stamps, right, etc. 3. Many Americans favor devolution in theory, as long as you cut someone else's program, because that whole concept of self-serving and self-interest, as long as it doesn't affect me, I don't really care. Okay? So you want to keep that in mind when you're thinking of this. But I do think you should look at that third section. Okay? So there's the 3 sources that are pushing for devolution. And there's a constant struggle between all of them, okay? Especially in recent years. As we were in the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration at the beginning of the 21st century, he campaigned on a commitment to a smaller national government. However, during the 8 years of the Bush administration, the national government became bigger and bigger and grew and became stronger. So the push for devolution was extremely weakened during that 8-year time period. By the time we got to the end of 2007, 2008, we had ailing financial institutions, so we had a substantial increase in government power. The first stimulus package was signed by President Bush before he left office to pull the financial sector out of the hole, and then the second one was signed by President Obama because he took power in the middle of a deep recession and a struggling financial time period. So that's where we pretty much leave it. And what we've seen during the Obama administration in the past 7 years so far, or 6 years, is we've seen an increase definitely in the growth of the economy, but it's been a very, very slow revival. Here's devolution and the Bush administration. Okay. Oh, tell me